Okay, folks, I'm Dr. Scott Pendleton, President of Harrison County Historical Society. We're asking for your patience because none of us here has ever run a Zoom meeting. And so we're going to just kind of do a little introduction while we're waiting to see if anybody else is going to join. So first thing is, if you have any questions, you use the chat function and we will answer the questions at the end of the presentation. The second thing is, this is put together by the Historical Society, the Genealogical Society, and of course the Piscataway Public Library. So we hope it works, and we hope you're patient. So when we think about mine deaths, we go back to the last big one in our country, which was the Upper Big Branch. Killed 29 miners in 2010. Craig Corder, who at the time was safety director at the Hopedale mine, was being interviewed by Bill O'Reilly, and Bill O'Reilly was talking about miners dying, and Craig said, miners get injured or die every week. You just don't pay attention until they die by the dozens. There's a fair amount of truth to that. Honestly, we're still losing about a miner every other week out of the coal mines across this state. The deaths have gotten less and less, partially because the crews are smaller, partially because of safety, partially because there's not as many people. Our worst mine disaster occurred in 1907 at Monaga, West Virginia, when 332 miners died in one accident. After that, in 1908, a miner a day died in Harrison and Belmont counties in that year. 352 miners died, one at a time, two at a time. You read the mine reports, they talk about these people, it says the mining inspector will say, these people can't speak English, but they're trying to tell us the mines are unsafe by hand signals. The owners are telling us we can't follow your rules or we would be bankrupt. This actually continued this way until 1933, and the National Recovery Act allowed mine organizers to go mine to mine. Don L. Lewis at this time took over, a little bit before this, took over the United Mine Workers. He was a force of nature. And after that, things started to change very rapidly. So safety, in the first 40 years of the century, about 1,000 miners a year died. In the second 40 or 30, about 500 miners a year died. In the 80s, it dropped down to about 200. In the 90s, it was less than 100. And now we're down to 25 a year. So this is our presentation of Harrison County's largest mine disaster. You should remember, while we're talking about this, in March of the same year, or February, I'm not sure which, at Willow Grove in Belmont County, 72 miners died. So between those 72 and these miners, we were at 103 in the two counties. So I hope you enjoy this. And I believe Jack is next on the agenda. Excuse us, folks. We've got to manually admit everybody that tries to join. Okay, got it, Jack.
Good evening. Before I begin this disaster they knew would happen, a few people I'd like to thank and some information I'd like to give you. First of all, back probably in June or July, I had run into Pam Ronsheim Gibson, and I told her that we were thinking about doing this, and she said, well, I think my grandmother has some notes in her diary, some entries in her diary that you might be interested in using. So in a little bit, I'll go through those for you. The other thing is, a number of people have talked to me wondering just exactly where this was. Well, for those of us that are from Harrison County, we know where Unionvale is. But you talk to somebody from New York City, they don't even know where Ohio is half the time. So we know that it was in Unionvale. But the actual location of the explosion, when I got to researching this and looked at the report from the Bureau of Mines, if you remember, US 22 used to run through East Cadiz to Hopedale directly before the new US 22 was put in. So that was 22, US 22. It is now County Road 5. So when you go through US 22 East or County Road 5, you go to the bottom of the hill on East Cadiz, and you'll see a little tavern on the left-hand side called the Meadowlark Inn. At that intersection of County Road 5 and US 22, 453 feet down, 3,393 feet in is where this explosion occurred. So we'll proceed now with disaster they knew would happen by giving you a little bit of information as Mrs. Isabel Ronchheim, Mrs. Milton Ronchheim, she and her husband ran the Cadiz Republican at the time. And once again, I want to thank Pam for this. November 29th, 1940. A terrible tragedy at the O&P mine this PM. About 30 to 33 men had been in a bad mine, full of gas and a terrible ceiling. The telephone began to ring and Milton began to take pictures, print pictures, answer the phone, help various newsmen who were here. The Columbus Dispatch, the Hearst Wire, AP, International News, and all of them very interesting and courteous and hurried. Some were here until 2 a.m. November 30th, 1940. A busy, full day, telephone messages, men here printing pictures, etc. Milton home so late and so tired. December 1st, 1940. Out to Spikers. Mr. S was the first man they got from the mine. Had to spend the rest of the day on calls and pictures, etc. Women at the auxiliary made soup. Edith Sheriff made some herself with Nell Porterfield and Martha McBee's help. Men here and a Red Cross woman to direct the relief. I made soup with Mama's help for the Legion, the Red Cross, and food for the mine rescue workers. Worked long and then on December 4th, 1940, worked long and hard and got much done. I'm glad the paper is out. It's a good one and deserves all the praise Milton got. But the accident put him so far behind. Once again, thank you, Pam. In 1977, the Akron Beacon Journal ran a supplement in their paper, and they came out and interviewed a few of the miners that had survived that accident. I've taken a few of the excerpts from that, plus a little bit of research that I've done on my own, so we'll continue on. In the summer of 1978, the Youghiogheny, Ohio Coal Company had signed orders from their main office in Cleveland that their Nelms #1 mine was to be filled with dirt, capped with concrete, and sealed shut. Throughout our area, one can only imagine where miners gathered socially, the old timers took note of the mine's passing. The Nelms mine, they will remember, was a killer mine. A few of the older men who in 1977 lived through the explosion of 1940 and paused and remembered their 31 buddies who never made it out. At that time, Alex McNabb recognized the sealing of the mine may have relieved him of some of the nightmares that probably endured from 1940 for the next 37 years. The explosion at the Nelms mine left 27 widows, 60 fatherless children. Most all of the towns in our immediate area were plunged into a period of deep mourning. As an irony, November 1940 was the year that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt designated the fourth Thursday of November to be Thanksgiving Day. There were 5 Thursdays in November of 1940. Employees of the mine continually said that the explosion was bound to happen. The Nelms, they said, was unsafe, too gassy, poorly ventilated. A slaughterhouse was their reference. Some cursed the greed of the Ohio and Pennsylvania Coal Company, which they said prized productivity and profits above men's lives. Some even blamed the state inspectors, calling them pawns of the company who winked at safety violations. And some of the men even blamed themselves. In 1977, Alex McNabb had lived his own private nightmare for 37 years. He was a section foreman at the mine when the disaster occurred. He helped bring out the bodies in the week-long aftermath. He agonized as one by one, men he had known and worked with for 10 to 15 years were searched out beneath the rubble, loaded onto coal cars and taken to the surface, and borne out on stretchers to a temporary morgue set up in the mine repair shop. McNabb went to the homes of the widows. He talked to their sons and daughters. All the while, Alex said he thought to himself, I knew this was going to happen. When all we all knew it. Men were going to die in that place, and we didn't do anything. We wanted to work. We needed to keep our jobs. For years, he was haunted. I'd lie in bed at night, trying to sleep, and I'd see those men, how they looked with their faces burned and all, and it really bothered me. The tragedy of the Nelms mine is that it was so predictable. We were all scared, McNabb said. We knew it was a very unsafe situation. Methane gas was liberating freely at the workbase. There wasn't sufficient ventilation to dissipate the gas. We all talked about it. We complained, but nothing was ever done to make it safer. Each day when the shift ended, Alex would climb in the back of his buddy's car for a ride home. He would squeeze over into the back corner and turn toward the window and pray, God, I'm so grateful to have gotten through another day in the mine. Alex was 73 years old and he was a very sturdily built Scotsman. I can remember him as a member of our church. And he worked a lifetime in the mines. As a sidebar, his son Jack, who was injured in the mine and later lost a limb in that mine, and his grandson John, who went on to Penn State to become a mining engineer, both worked into the depths of our Mother Earth. During his interview, it was hard for Alex to speak of his good friends and who perished on that fateful day. It happened at 1:20 p.m., November 29th, 1940. Alex had just left the mine at the end of his shift. It happened just as he feared it would. They think a spark from a drilling machine ignited the methane gas that had been allowed to accumulate at the working face. Instantly, the flames consumed the oxygen requiring its quest for air. The wall of fire rushed outward, creating a vacuum that pulled the flames back to the working face. And the back and forth rush, the fire fed on the explosive dust that hung in the air. The surging and burning fury took place in the blink of an eye. 31 men were killed instantly. A mile away in an underground dispatch shanty, 2 miners were trapped in a choking, swirling whirl of blinding dust. Jack Marcus and Ed Parsons hunkered helplessly under a bench as the explosion, which was giving off an indescribable sound that rose and fell, taking away the life-giving air. But those 2 survived. Unfortunately, it was the beginning of the Christmas season in the villages of Amsterdam, Bergholz, Cadiz, Cambridge, Hopedale, Jewett, Kilgore, New Athens, New Rumley, Scio, and of course Unionvale, where colored lights and tinsel hung on home fronts and storefronts. In Cadiz, the U.S. flags flew at half-staff, and all Christmas programs were canceled. Most families had someone in the mine, a father, son, grandfather, or just a neighbor. The disaster touched every home. The strange mysteries that were brought forth during the services of these victims, a number of people marveled at the ironies that doomed one man after another and spared another. Wes Camel might have been a victim that day, but November 29, 1940 was his 40th wedding anniversary. He left work early to celebrate with family and friends, which were having a party for them, and this spared his life. Pete Spiker, who I mentioned from Mrs. Ronsheim's notes, would have had Thursday, the day before the disaster, off, but he worked and signed up to work the 29th to make a little extra money. He promised his daughter a violin for Christmas. His was the first body found. Tardiness saved Charlie Stewart. 1 minute late for work, he missed the elevator going down to 12 North. He took the next ride down and was sent to work in another section, untouched by the blast. An official inquiry was launched to find the cause of the explosion. State and federal mine inspectors took testimony for 5 days before standing room only crowds at our courthouse. Miners clustered in the hallways and discussed among themselves their own theories. The Ohio and Pennsylvania Coal Company said they had put a high premium on productivity to offset the expense of its sophisticated equipment. Nelms 1 was a showplace when it opened in 1927. It was the most mechanized mine in the country, the most productive at 3,000 tons a day, and it was the deepest in Ohio. According to the men who worked there, it was the most dangerous. Ventilation was abominable. There was never enough air to adequately clear the explosive gases. Crews worked too fast and with too little attention to safety. The drill that sparked the explosion was found to have 8 out of 10 missing bolts in its switch box, which was a sloppy, illegal practice that was tolerated because it made it quicker to get into the machine for repairs. No action was ever taken against the O&P Coal Company, but it led to its death. The company went broke, and about a year later, the Y&O Coal Company, the Youghiogheny, Ohio Coal Company, took it over, and the mine was productive from that point since. The Beacon Journal interviewed a number of survivors to the publication in its publication of this supplement. Cecil Dutton was retired at the time of his interview in 1977. He was said to be a neat, methodical man who ironically kept a diary every day he worked. As he scanned through the pages of his notebook, he talked about the day the mine exploded. I was working in Section 1 West, 18 North. At 1:20, the power went off. The mine phone rang. We were told there was something wrong in 12 North. We didn't know if there was much of a chance for us, but we came out of there in an orderly manner. But I ain't saying we weren't scared. Dutton and the crew of 40 men in that section were saved by a twist of fate. The awful force of the blast knocked out a temporary stoping, short-circuiting the airway and allowing carbon monoxide out and fresh air in. Had the stoping been a permanent masonry structure, it would have held fast, and the men would have been trapped in what was called black damp. This is a term used in the mining industry that refers to the suffocating mixture of carbon dioxide and other gases, which reduces the amount of oxygen and causes asphyxiation. As Mr. Dutton continued his talk of the disaster, his eyes turned down to a little whistle laying on his lap. It belonged to Dave McIntyre. When we found him, the cord was burned off. I picked up the whistle and I put it in my pocket. We worked together and were good friends. Cecil never forgot the lessons he learned at the Nelms mine. When he became a section foreman, he insisted on 15-minute safety meetings at the start of each of his shifts. Jack Marcus, who was 67 years old at the time of the interview in 1977, started in the mines when he was 13 years old. That was the day when kids really wanted to work in the mine, and they would lie about their age. But they could start at 16, but they would lie about their age so that they could get in. By another twist of fate, he lived through the explosion. He recalled, and this name should be familiar to a lot of you, I was in the dispatch shanty with Bob Browning. He was the mine foreman who lost his life. When Bob came in, he said, "Jack, I couldn't sleep a wink last night. I'm really worried. You know, that place up there is dangerous. There's no air." After Browning left, Marcus and Ed Parsons sat down together in the shanty to take a rest. I leaned back in the old lazy back chair and looked up at the light hanging down above me. That light got dimmer and dimmer, and suddenly the shanty door blew open and the wind started howling and whistling. Dust and dirt filled the shanty, and there was a sound like 1,000 men were throwing rocks at us. My mouth was full of grit, nasty. I thought I was going to choke. My tongue felt as big as my fist. The sound came in waves. It would get stronger and weaker as that gas was burning up in there. We couldn't see a thing. I took off my cap light and I held it right to the ground, and still I couldn't see anything. Then everything stopped. There was no movement. The phone rang. Jack, get up in Maine West and get those guys out of there. Marcus knew the men in Maine West were in danger. Their air supply was the same as the disaster-struck 12 North. If they weren't helped out quickly, the miners would die in the Black Dam wake of the explosion. Marcus and Parsons made their way through the maze to the doorway that separated Maine West. When I opened the door, I could see a bunch of lights. A guy yelled, "Is it safe to come down?" I said, "Yeah, come on down." And they all came running and never stopped. Those 40 were saved. Francis Wood, who became a federal mine inspector later in his life, was unfortunate to have lost his father in this explosion. I was 17 when Dad died. He said, I heard it on the radio. My mother always listened to a soap opera called Portia Faces Life. At the beginning of the program, they broke in and said there'd been an explosion at the Nelms mine. Neighbors drove us to the mine, but the deputies had the place blocked off. They told us there was no hope. Go on home. Wood says his father, like the others, had premonitions for weeks before the disaster. He would be sitting, staring off to space, and Mom would ask him what he's thinking about. And he said, "I'm just thinking about the mine," he would say. He knew the mine was going to blow. He just didn't know when. As Francis continued, he said, "Somebody drove me to the Sweeney Funeral Home in Amsterdam to identify Dad's body. Having seen others, Mr. Sweeney asked if I wished to see the body, and I said, no. I decided I wanted to remember Dad as the last time I saw him." We are here this evening, joined by you folks virtually, commemorating 80 years that took 31 lives out of the Pennsylvania and Ohio coal mine. Fortunately or unfortunately, I was lucky enough to be the person that sometimes had to go out to that mine in an ambulance to rescue miners. I've been in a number of organizations, but there's one thing I will say about underground coal miners. There's a brotherhood there that nobody can talk about. They are connected with an insoluble chain of sincere affection that nobody can realize what happens. They may be up in the shower house, arguing about a football game or whatever, but when they got on that elevator and they stood back to back, back to front, and shoulder to shoulder, they were brothers because they knew the men that surrounded them, their lives relied on that. We're very fortunate that this hasn't happened. As Scott just said a little bit ago, the safety instructions and things that are going on today have made mining a much safer industry for people to participate in. I've been fortunate enough to have gone down in a number of the mines, and I always joke with the fellows that took me down, well, when you put windows down there, I think I'll take a job. But it's so safe down there today, it's unbelievable. And folks, I just hope that you've enjoyed this. I'll turn this back over to Scott, who will give you a little history into the investigation of the explosion and things that happened thereafter. Thank you very much.
Things were a little different back then. They had an investigation within about 2 weeks. So this is just verbatim from the Cadiz Republican, December 12, 1940. This week, the Common Pleas courtroom is the scene of one of the most exacting scenes in a century. A hearing by the Department of Industrial Relations in the effort to fix the cause and blame, if any, for the deaths of 31 men in the Nelms mine disaster, November 29. The unwritten penalty, if it can be placed, will be a haunting conscience carried to the grave. The hearing, which is carried to Tuesday, December 19, 1940, is bringing okay, there's some sentence missing there, is doubtful if the finger can put any specific single cause on the explosion. According to opinion of John Forbes, federal inspector, 2 pieces of equipment in room 13 could have made the spark which caused the explosion. A mining machine, which was found with the switch on, and a drill. Considerable was said about whether this drill was a permissible one, meaning one which passed the federal test. Director of Industrial Relations, George Strain, follows his assistant, Nelson Hovey, with questions on federal requirements and practice, indicating the importance which the 2 bureaus might place upon the outcome of the investigation. Director Strain sought clarification on whether a piece of equipment not examined and passed by the Federal Bureau might not be as safe as one that had been passed as permissible. First to testify was Marcus Kerr, Cadiz Chief of Mines, who was on the stand most of Monday. He laid the foundation for the following witnesses, telling of efforts to recover the bodies and finding them, evidences of the explosion, and finding of methane gas from 5 to 15% content in Section 2. George Grove, federal inspector, later said the gas feeders at the face of room 13 were audible at the times the body were found. With the exact volume of the gas in room 13 was at 1:20 p.m. November 29 will never be known. What caused it to be there in such quantities was a point to be determined. Mr. Kerr testified that one of the victims was working on a door on the entry on which the air is taken in half an hour before. It was brought out that if the door was partly open, it might cause an important deflection of the air, short-circuiting the air flow temporarily, allowing the gas to accumulate in quantities larger than usual. Cars were also found holding another door open to Mr. Kerr, according to Mr. Kerr. J.C. Wilson, gas and oil inspector for Bureaus of Mines, testified that 4 uncharted and abandoned wells have been found in the past few days. One theory has been that the drilling for a shot, the drill entered on one of these old wells and released explosive gas. J.T. Isles, state embalmer, testified the bodies were highly decomposed and the men who had been caught under the roof falls had breathed a considerable carbon monoxide before the explosion. On the stand Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning was C.W. Owings of the Federal Bureau of Mines. He had many specific figures and measurements taken in the mine and proved a valuable witness. The United Mine Workers requested that their counsel be allowed to question and cross-examine the witnesses. This was denied, saying the department is solely responsible for the investigation, and if one group is given permission, then they must all be given permission. Our one desire, he said, is to ascertain and determine the facts. We have endeavored to carry out the desire and will continue in the same line. If the miners have any question, we will gladly permit them to testify. The comments made by the miners have said they believe this to be a fair hearing. After 5 days of testimony, they came up with several findings. Finding number 1 was that Section 12 north of the mine had excessive gas at various times, but not especially so on November 29th, except apparently at the time of explosion. The UMW had asked a special inspection sometime before. Gas found 2 days before was ordered remedied by state inspectors. Lawrence Oliver, foreman of the preceding shift, said there was less than 2% mixture in a small area, but said it was his duty to take care of it. John Harden, fire boss on the previous shift, said there was some gas in 13. William Ramsey, safety director, reported it clear of gas a short time before the explosion with good circulating air. 2, there was a sudden release of methane gas in room 13, probably by the cutting machine, which had the switch on when found later. Whether this gas came in such high pressure that air could not take care of it, or whether there was a temporary stoppage of air at this time because of a stone fall or door carelessly left open, will never be known. The coincidence of an accumulation of gas and a spark at the same time caused explosion. The spark could have come from the power on the cutting machine or drill, could have come from the striking a hard stony formation in the coal formation. Many bolts were missing from both pieces of machinery. Idris Parsons, mine mechanic, testified it was common practice to leave bolts out of machinery so they can easily get into them and maintain them. He also said that doors are often left open although Ramsey said such a violation of safety precautions would result in immediate dismissal. 4, the first gas explosion was believed to be incidental, resulting in a second heavier explosion that followed with the speed of lightning. 31 men died instantly, probably of concussion. The recovery work went forward with precision and speed. Don Harris, state mine director or inspector, said the gaseous condition found by him 2 days before when this section was down had been remedied, or there would have been an explosion a day earlier than it was. He also said that any section there is bound to be flamed during a 7-hour shift, for sparks and open ignition can't be eliminated entirely in a coal mine. Harris started his testimony by saying he had recommended the sinking of a second air shaft, but it was told it was too expensive and would take weeks to do. Harvey Nelms, superintendent, said he had never been told another shaft was needed. He stated that the existing fan was in excellent condition and that had been sped up to capacity, for the question of insufficiency of air was never brought forward. Transcripts of all testimony were taken by Mrs. Ruth Swan. So essentially, what happened that day was most likely a rapid release of methane gas from a pocket, either from an abandoned well or from a naturally occurring pocket. The ignition, what happens, the ignition, when it ignites, it burns. In order to burn, it's got to pull air in. It pulls air in to explode, and when it explodes, it pushes the air back out. And in most of these cases, the concussion actually is what kills the men, not the flames or the lack of oxygen or anything like that. So on that day, 32 Harrisonians died. And in commemoration of this, if we were to do a panel, of all the mine deaths in this county, it would be hundreds long. Many mines occurred 1 or 2 at a time and did not even make mention of any paper outside the local paper. But we have the Harrison County Historical Society has had a plaque made. I guess I'll hold it up here. Jack, we put that up on this?
Yeah.
Can you see all right?
Yeah, we got half the head down.
So this obviously isn't a plaque, because with the good old COVID going on, the plaque is back ordered until next June, I think. So there will be a plaque commemorating the 80th anniversary, and the 31 lives will be listed. So that'll be presented at a ceremony whenever we get it. I hope you've enjoyed this. Now, Sue Adams, who is involved with the Harrison County Genealogical Society, is going to present a memoriam. And while she's doing that, I'm going to check the chat function and see if there are any questions that need answered.
I'm going to be reading the names of the 31 who perished. Before I do that, here at the library and at the Visitor Center, this Crossroads magazine, Marcia Hartman did a really great article on the mine disaster to be featured in their November magazine. And at the Harrison County Historical Society, we have this Harrisonian that has a nice write-up in it also. And anyone that's interested, come to the library for the Crossroads or the Visitor Center. And we'll try to have some of these Harrisonians here at the library. I know the others that worked on this program, and before I read the names, it was very emotional to do this when you think of the people and the names that you still recognize in the county today. So I'm going to read these off, and you think about all of the families that were affected. And like Jack said, it's not just the wife and the children, it's the parents and the rest of the relatives. We think the list is in the name that the bodies were recovered. They're not in alphabetical order, and that's the way they were in the paper. Pete Spiker, 38, of Cadiz. Louis Sedgmer, 39, of Cadiz. Dan Smith, 63, of Jewett. Ed Prather, 47, of New Rumley. Ora Farms, 32, of Cadiz. John Bernard, 42, of Cadiz. Francis Wood, 41, of Kilgore. Harold Darbo, 44, of Cadiz. Clifford Rail, 53, of Cadiz. Emerson Howes, 26, of Cadiz. John Mattern, 29, of Cadiz. John L. Smith, 22, of New Athens. Robert Browning, 48, of Hopedale. George Daddle, 51, of Unionvale. Frank Mazurowski, 40, of Unionvale. Benny Mazurowski, 25, of Cadiz. Homer Knox, 44, of Cadiz. Edgar Marchbank, 20, of Cadiz. Jesse Rail, 48, of Cadiz. James Hauber, 24, of Jewett. Leonard Fannin, 26, of Cambridge. Stephen Namath Jr., 29, of Cadiz. Joe Horniak, 32, of Adena. Brian Griffin, 43, of Burkholtz. David McIntyre, 27, of Amsterdam. Andy Marcus, 65, of Amsterdam. Julius Courtville, 59, of Piney Fork. Robert Dinger, 35, of Jewett. Alfred James, 49, of Amsterdam. Michael Finn, 35, of Burkholtz. And William Carr, 40, of Hopedale.
So that concludes our memoriam, a little history lesson. Let me go up here, check chat room because I couldn't check it from back here. Okay, looks good. So folks, we have recorded this. It'll be available on the library website, I am assuming. And what we're going to do is we're going to sign off now. And we're going to leave the PowerPoint run until everybody has left the waiting room. So I hope you have enjoyed this. And I hope our first venture into Zoom presentations was not too painful for you. Thank you very much for attending.